Well, thank all of you and thank ISIS, Shin Kong, Jin Tiong, for inviting me to speak to you this morning. It's a bit reckless of you, Siuman, but anyway, I must warn all of you that I do not have anything particular original to offer. So take what I have to say only as an invitation to a discussion. Now you asked about an animal. There is a famous Indian parable about a group of blind men trying to describe an elephant by touch. The man who happened upon a tusk thought that an elephant is like a spear. The man who felt the trunk decided that an elephant is like a snake, while three others who felt the animal's body, leg, and tail concluded that an elephant was like a wall or a tree or a rope. Now, the parable does not record what happened to that group of blind men, but one might reasonably surmise that groping a large animal in the dark probably did not end very well. Well, I'm certainly not going to try to grope the elephant. Instead, I will try to contextualize ASEAN's idea of the Indo-Pacific by situating it within other ideas of the Indo-Pacific. The ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific is not an inconsiderable achievement, but I must tell you, I do not find the text itself, I do not find the text in itself particularly interesting. The context is more significant. About 3.5 years ago, in the first of my IPS Northern lectures, I observed that ours was an age without definition. Almost 30 years after the end of the Cold War, we then had no better way of describing our era than by reference to the era that preceded. We could only call our times the post-Cold War. Are we now better able to define the post-Cold War strategic environment, particularly in our region, and formulate coherent strategies for it? Well, I don't think so. Ideas such as the pivot or rebalance, and now the Indo-Pacific or China's Belt and Road initiative, to which the Indo-Pacific is very largely a response. And I don't think we can consider the Indo-Pacific in isolation from the BRI, are, I think, best understood as slogans. Slogans that seek tentatively and imperfectly to grasp new geopolitical realities that are still fluid and malleable. They are not precise concepts whose meaning commands general agreement. Insofar as their advocates try to persuade others to accept these new ideas, there are also attempts at shaping these new realities. However, the hard fact is that slogans are not strategies. This has been clear from the outset in the case of the Indo-Pacific, which has a Rashomon-like quality. Rashomon comes from the title of a short story by a Japanese author in which a single event is seen very differently by a number of people. And this is perhaps appropriate since the origins of the idea can be traced back to speeches given 12 years ago in 2007 by Prime Minister Abe during his first term and Aso Taro, then Foreign Minister. The Japanese idea of the Indo-Pacific has evolved considerably since then, and today probably has the clearest resolution of all versions. The US has adopted the slogan of free and open Indo-Pacific as a new strategic organizing concept and has renamed PACOM accordingly. The US idea is perhaps the most straightforward of all the versions. The American idea is not exactly the same as the Japanese idea, even though Japan is its most important East Asian ally. India and Australia are clearly part of the Indo-Pacific, however you may wish to define it, and have adopted the term. And South Korea has recently come up with a so-called New Southern Policy that shares some features of other ideas of the Indo-Pacific. ASEAN's idea is only one of several. But what all versions of the Indo-Pacific have loosely, and I stress loosely, in common is first, the recognition that geography is always politically and not just physically defined, and that the separation of the Pacific and Indian Oceans and India from East Asia was strategically somewhat artificial. Secondly, it is clear that some degree of concern over certain aspects of Chinese behavior underlie the idea. But even these common aspects are not without ambiguity. The US, Japan, India, South Korea, Australia, and ASEAN do not have exactly the same concerns about China, do not hold their concerns with the same intensity, and are still trying to reconcile these concerns with other interests. Well, does, for example, free and open in the American version refer to trade? Or does it refer to freedom of navigation? Or both? And if both, what degree of priority is to be placed on each of these meanings? Even geographically, where are the western boundaries of the Indo-Pacific? Is it the west coast of India, the east coast of Africa, the Persian Gulf? Or is it just a means of emphasizing interdependence and the connectivity of the oceans? And does acceptance of one meaning of the Indo-Pacific commit you to accept other meanings? Since proponents of the idea of the Indo-Pacific have different notions of it, ASEAN's initial reaction when the idea was mooted was, quite unsurprisingly, puzzlement and ambivalence. ASEAN's idea is still among the more cautious. Southeast Asia lies across the strategic connection point of the Pacific and Indian Oceans. And no definition of the Indo-Pacific is likely to work very well without ASEAN support. It was therefore also unsurprising that China has displayed what one Chinese scholar has called, and I quote, a curious nonchalance towards the Indo-Pacific. But before Chinese friends start prematurely congratulating themselves on the incoherence of the Indo-Pacific idea, let me point out that the BRI also has its own ambiguities and its own Rashomon-like quality. Chinese claims that it is a win-win, or more grandiosely intended to benefit all mankind, are no longer taken at face value if they ever were, except perhaps by the terminally naive or irredeemably corrupt. Is the BRI primarily an economic idea, or a military strategic idea, or both? And if both, where is the emphasis? Does the emphasis shift from project to project? Will the emphasis shift over time? And if so, in what direction? Does accepting one definition of the BRI necessarily compel you to accept other definitions? Now, the BRI has clearly been more widely accepted than the Indo-Pacific idea. But now that the uncritical initial excitement over the BRI has calmed down, these questions and others have become more salient. And the BRI label has been rather promiscuously attached to a diverse array of projects in almost every geographic region. What practical strategic value, whether economic or military, can be attributed to an idea whose boundaries are so broad and so amorphous? No one is going to shun the BRI. That would be silly. But there is greater skepticism as the potential liabilities as well as its benefits become evident. And the liabilities accrue to China too. Beijing has adopted a more measured and modest tone about its own project. Now, although we are not much closer to an agreed new description of our times, we are now at least able to better identify the key geopolitical forces that make for the more fluid and uncertain environment that we are all grappling with. Briefly, a resurgent but more transactional US, a more confident, heightened long-term US strategic competition, a China that is sobered but still ambitious, a more confident Japan and India, Australia and South Korea somewhat discombobulated and yet to find a new equilibrium, and ASEAN still irreplaceable but somewhat adrift. Fortunately, perhaps by luck more than management, in generally the right direction. Now, I've never believed that the US under the Trump administration was in retreat. That trope is still being propagated, although the administration has made it absolutely clear by word and deed that it is resolved to compete robustly with China and to a certain degree with Russia, with trade and investment transfers as its preferred instruments, and has once again emphasized the old policy of peace through strength. Now, whatever you may think about these policies, they cannot be accurately described as a retreat. What was and is still by some inaccurately described as a retreat was in fact a greater emphasis on values and themes that have never been absent from American foreign policy. Unilateralism, a preference for bilateralism over multilateralism, a demanding attitude towards friends and allies, skepticism about free trade, a penchant for persuasion by coercion, and the unpredictability that is inherent in the American electoral cycle. Now, Mr. Trump amplifies these themes, but he did not invent any of them. Of course, other more benign values and themes have also characterized American foreign policy. We all know that. But American friends often choose to forget that the shining city on a hill has always cast a dark shadow. And those of us who have had to at least occasionally live in that shadow know that America has always had another set of values. It is that alternative set of values that is now being emphasized. The emphasis on one set of American values over the other is a reaction to the hubris that contaminated American foreign policy after the Cold War. Hubris took one set of American values to extremes and sucked the US into interminable wars in the Middle East, leading to disillusionment of a large section of the American public with the political establishment. And without the existential Soviet challenge, and when it became clear that the post-Cold War so-called New World Order was going to be elusive and costly in blood and treasure, it was quite natural for Americans to ask why they should bear any burden or pay any price to maintain international order. Time to put one's own house in order and look to American interests. The Trump administration is one manifestation of this political phenomenon. When Mr. Obama successfully rode into the White House promising change, he was not primarily speaking about change abroad, but about change at home. In other words, about putting America first. Obama's fluent rhetoric glossed over this fact, while Trump's delight in playing their enfant terrible obscured continuities and similarities in policy goals. But insofar as both sought to spread the burdens of leadership while maintaining American primacy, Obama and Trump have more in common than perhaps either would care to admit. Don't forget that multilateralism is a form of burden sharing. And I think Obama promoted multilateralism as a means of maintaining American primacy and not in order to renounce it. The new emphasis is therefore a structural response of American foreign policy to a new geopolitical situation that is going to persist beyond the Trump administration. Future administrations are going to differ from the Trump administration, at least in my opinion, in degree, but not in kind. A different president may conduct himself less flamboyantly and express himself more circumspectly. Another administration may not take quite the same glee in disruption. It may formulate and communicate policy with greater coherence and deliberation. And all this will be to the good. But it's not going to be the same America again. Trump's approach has been described as transactional, and so it is. But in this respect, the center of gravity of American foreign policy has shifted. The world has changed. So why are we surprised that America has changed? Robust strategic competition is another feature of this new America. Competition has always been an element of US-China relations. But from 1972, when the two countries re-established relations until quite recently, the overall emphasis of the relationship, US-China relations, was tilted towards engagement. Engagement is not going to entirely cease. Still, the overall emphasis has now clearly tilted in the other direction. A tougher approach towards China is one of the few issues on which there is bipartisan consensus in Washington. If there's a disagreement over the Trump administration's China policy, It is over the details of its means, not its goals. And the US idea of a free and open Indo-Pacific is an expression of American discomfort with the more symmetrical strategic equation that is emerging, its determination to resist, and the new US direction. But this is not a new Cold War and cannot be. The Cold War metaphor is misleading. The Soviet Union was containable because it very largely contained itself by pursuing autarky. But China is as vital a node in the world economy as is the US. Globalization may be fraying at its edges, but I doubt it can be entirely reversed. The technologies that drive globalization cannot be unlearned. And technology will eventually erode the cost advantages of some widely distributed supply chains and reconfigure some of them. And this could pose challenges to the aspirations of some ASEAN countries to move up the value chain and to ASEAN's goal of creating a common production platform in Southeast Asia. But decoupling cannot be complete. What will probably emerge is a greater diversification and more complex, contradictory, and fluid patterns of interests and relationships. And whatever we choose to call it, Indo-Pacific will do as well as any other appellation. The region can never again be as starkly demarcated as it was during the Cold War. So neither the US nor China are likely to achieve their goals in entirety. Of course, this does not mean that the US and China are not going to try. Washington and Beijing may swear blind that they are not going to make other countries choose. But we shouldn't be naive. The reality will be otherwise. However, hubris is not an American monopoly. Hubris led Beijing to fundamentally misread the direction of American foreign policy, exaggerate China's strengths, downplay China's vulnerabilities, and brush aside growing international concerns with certain aspects of Chinese behavior. The trade war and long-term strategic competition with the US has highlighted all these mistakes to the extent that they can no longer be concealed, even from the Chinese people. Now, popular support for the Chinese Communist Party is still high. It has, after all, improved the lives of hundreds of millions of ordinary Chinese. But internal criticism of Xi Jinping within the Chinese elite, including some sections of the party, also seems to be increasing. Party rule and Xi's position are not at immediate risk. The Chinese Communist Party is, I think, nevertheless approaching an inflection point, and some fundamental decisions cannot continue to be postponed indefinitely. A bit of political history. The 18th Party Congress, Chinese Communist Party Congress in 2012, which formally anointed Xi Jinping, had also acknowledged that the policies that led to spectacular growth in the 1990s were unsustainable and nearing the end of their shelf life. Slower growth was going to be the new norm. A new growth model was needed to sustain growth. At the 18th Congress's third plenum in 2013, the Chinese Communist Party announced that the focus of restructuring of China's economic system would, and I quote, allow the market to play a decisive role in the allocation of resources. Now, allowing the market a decisive role is sound economic logic. Who can argue with that? But economic logic came up against a fact so obvious that it is often overlooked by observers. And that fact is China is a communist country, and the Chinese Communist Party is a Leninist party. A Leninist party claims and demands absolute control over every aspect of state and society. And by definition, a greater role for the market means less control. As China's economy grows in size and sophistication, Deng Xiaoping's neat solution of separating politics from economics has become much more difficult to sustain. The separation cannot be as neat once all the easy economic steps have been taken, as they have. A new balance between party control and economic efficiency is obviously needed. But what was that new balance to be? And that's not so obvious. It wasn't obvious in 2012. It was still not obvious by the time of the 19th Party Congress in 2017. At the 19th Congress, Xi Jinping's redefinition of the principal contradiction, that Marxist term, principal contradiction, facing the CCP as, and I quote again, between unbalanced and inadequate development and the people's ever-growing needs for a better life, was a recognition that the continuation of party rule and the realization of China's global ambitions rested on the Chinese Communist Party's ability to meet rising popular expectations. But it made the challenge of finding a new balance between control and market efficiency more difficult. The redefinition of the principal contradiction prescribed a lengthy and complex domestic agenda. I won't go through it, but there are about 16 or 17 items, all in the speech, which you can go and count. I mean, depending how you count, 16 or 17 by my count. Dealing with that agenda will require a long time and immense resources. Exactly how long, no one can precisely predict, nor can anyone predict exactly how much resources will be needed. But the time available to deal with the issues is certainly not infinite, and while China's reserves are huge, they are certainly not inexhaustible. And Beijing is beginning to recognize this fact. The core challenge facing China can be simply stated. Continually replenishing resources over the long period needed to deal with rising expectations requires growth. Sustaining growth requires a new economic model based on greater economic efficiency. A new model requires a new balance between party control and economic efficiency. Establishing a new balance necessarily entails risk. Mitigating the political risk requires growth to satisfy rising expectations. But growth requires a new model. And so it goes on. Thus far, no Chinese leader has found the will to take the risks needed to break this somewhat tautological cycle by decisive action. Policy has largely been a series of improvisations, sometimes brilliant improvisations, but nonetheless still improvisations rather than what is needed to fundamentally address the core issue. Now, the Chinese Communist Party's caution and fear of loss of control is not irrational. A big country that has undergone economic and social transformations of such scale and scope in such a short period of time is naturally internally roiled and potentially unstable. An unstable China poses far greater challenges than an authoritarian China, not the least of which is to the Chinese people. And I see no practical alternative to Chinese Communist Party rule for China. It is therefore entirely unsurprising that Xi Jinping has opted for greater party control. But while rational, this choice has sharpened the core challenge of balancing control with economic efficiency. Seen in this perspective, the BRI is as much, or perhaps even more, an expedient to sustain growth, a means of buying time rather than a coherent new strategy. The BRI is at present a disparate collection of projects based on externalizing the old Chinese model, that model that the 18th Party Congress acknowledged was unsustainable, externalizing the old Chinese model, which is heavily reliant on state-owned enterprise-led infrastructure investment, wrapped up in a slogan presented as a strategy. Now, I don't underestimate the BRI's potential, but potential is just that, potential, something that may or may not be realized. It is not a certainty. Whether the BRI will eventually cohere into something that is more than the sum of its parts remains to be seen. It has become evident that the Chinese model does not always transplant very well in foreign soil. The BRI has engendered resistance as well as influence. In Southeast Asia and other regions, including in close Chinese friends like Pakistan, BRI projects have provoked a variety of complaints. Some have been trimmed down, some have been renegotiated, and some suspended or cancelled. The BRI transverses some of the world's most complicated geopolitical terrain. Implementation is bound to be patchy. Some projects will work better than others, and some will eventually fail. Examples available during question and answer. And with pressing domestic needs, Beijing has itself come to recognize that it cannot afford to indefinitely subsidize unviable projects. Some process of winnowing out the unviable must sooner or later take place. These internal and external complexities are all exacerbated by the new environment of heightened strategic competition with the US, as well as by unforced errors such as Xinjiang. China will not give in to external pressure. Some of the structural changes to the Chinese economy that the Trump administration has demanded strike at the very heart of the communist system. China cannot agree, but Beijing cannot indefinitely ignore internal pressures and expectations. Now, I'm certainly not suggesting that China will fail. The Chinese Communist Party is an adaptive organization and inherits the experience of more than a century of political, economic, and social experimentation. Were it not so, it could not have thrown up a leader like Deng Xiaoping, capable of looking dispassionately at his life's work, deciding it was flawed, and abruptly, fundamentally changing course in order to preserve his life's work. But the dilemmas and trade-offs now confronting China are more numerous, more complex, and more daunting than those Deng Xiaoping faced. Externally, China has changed tactics, but not its ambition. Internally, Xi and the Chinese Communist Party are playing for time rather than making fundamental decisions. Inflection points, such as those that I think the Communist Party is approaching, inflection points are breeding grounds for gray and black swans. The longer fundamental decisions are postponed, the more likely is it that such creatures may suddenly appear. We should not be unduly surprised if they do. Let me move on to other countries. Japan was the first major East Asian country to recognize that something had fundamentally changed in the strategic environment. Mr. Abe's early advocacy of the Indo-Pacific was one indication, as was his insistence that Japan should become a normal country. Abe did not achieve very much in his first term, but he pursued these ideas with renewed vigor and confidence in his second term and his third term. And how many other terms he's going to have, I do not care to guess. He pursued them with vigor and confidence while tempering their sharper anti-China edges by giving the idea a stronger economic focus. Among other things, Japan took the lead in reconfiguring the TPP without America and injecting more emphasis on economics and connectivity into its idea of the Indo-Pacific. It has steadily helped key members of ASEAN build maritime capabilities. Tokyo has made quiet but significant modifications to internal laws and regulations to allow the self-defense forces to acquire new capabilities and take on a broader range of missions within the US-Japan alliance. And the ultimate purpose of all these new directions and Japan's idea of the Indo-Pacific is to anchor a transactional US in the region by making Japan a more equal partner. India. India's membership of the East Asia Summit and its embrace of the idea of the Indo-Pacific are indications that its strategic ambitions are not confined to South Asia. But India is a huge and complicated country, a rambunctious democracy that is immensely difficult to govern. Most of its energy is always going to be directed inwards. Its capabilities are still limited. Externally, its key priorities lie westward in Pakistan and by extension Afghanistan and the Middle East. In the East, its key concern will always be China, with whom it shares a troubled border of more than 20,000 kilometers. Border issues are in turn entangled with the complex issues of Kashmir and Tibet. ASEAN and other East Asian countries are largely instrumental to these concerns. From this perspective, India's idea of the Indo-Pacific seems to be a means of garnering support garnering support for, or at least neutralizing opposition towards, its specific concerns by encompassing them within a broader concept in order to regionalize them and make them seem less parochial. But India has yet to reconcile its idea of the Indo-Pacific with the lingering attachment of some members of its foreign policy establishment to its non-aligned traditions. Sentimentality over non-alignment must eventually dissipate. But in a broader sense, the idea of non-alignment also points to a global, almost universalist aspect of India's strategic identity that is larger than the Indo-Pacific and will remain even if the specific terminology of non-alignment is abandoned. It is as yet unclear how the global and the regional will figure in India's strategy. But it is certain that as a big and ancient country, India is never going to play deputy to any sheriff, no matter what slogan that role is wrapped in. Australia. Australia's geographic isolation has dictated its essentially simple traditional strategy. Identify the most powerful country with compatible interests and values and hug it tightly. This was adequate as long as the most powerful country was Britain or America. But the more symmetrical strategic equation and the more complex pattern of relationships and contradictory interests that is now emerging seems to have left Australia somewhat disoriented and unsure how to reconcile these complexities with its alliance with the US. It has swung from a somewhat naive engagement of China under the previous Labour government to uncritical suspicion of China under the current Liberal government, particularly after Chinese influence operations were exposed. Now, Canberra is not unaware, Canberra is aware of these complexities. And I doubt that another change of government will see a swing back to the old naive extreme. But I also doubt that Canberra has reached a stable equilibrium or settled on a roadmap forward. At any rate, Prime Minister Scott Morrison's first foreign policy speech in June this year, entitled Where We Live, which was on the Indo-Pacific, gives the impression that Australia's idea of the Indo-Pacific encompasses but does not attempt to even minimally reconcile all the complexities and contradictions confronting Australia. It is an attempt to buy time and rhetorically evade the complexities by wrapping them in a slogan rather than a strategy for dealing with them. Buying time is a legitimate diplomatic tactic, and Australia is not alone in adopting such an approach. South Korea. South Korea's version of the Indo-Pacific is the least coherent. The Moon administration's so-called New Southern Policy is economic in focus and incorporates India and Southeast Asia. It recognizes that the ROK had been over-dependent on the Chinese market, a fact brought home very harshly by China's response to the THAAD deployment. But as South Korean companies have long been active in India and Southeast Asia, the New Southern Policy is not really new, and like the BRI, is largely a collection of projects. North Korea has left successive South Korean administrations of right and left with little capacity or inclination to think in broader strategic terms about anything, actually. Seoul's approach to India and ASEAN has always been more transactional and commercially driven rather than strategic. Now, where does all this leave ASEAN's idea of the Indo-Pacific as described in the document, which I am sure many of you have seen, in the document adopted at its 34th summit on 23rd June 2019. I am not going to bore you by examining that document in detail. For those of you who are interested, I refer you to the excellent ISIS Perspective paper number 51 by Huang Thi Ha, sitting around somewhere, lurking around somewhere, entitled ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific, Old Wine in New Bottles. I agree with her analysis. Of course, she may not agree with the conclusions I draw from my substantially similar analysis, so whatever I have to say is not her fault, remember that. Let me emphasize 3 points. First, Old wine, though it certainly is, arriving at a consensus on a new bottle is not a negligible achievement. Given the obvious differences in interests of member states and the range of their strategic assessments, it is a significant document in that it preserves ASEAN's fundamental consensus of always trying to have a consensus on regional issues, even if it is only a consensus of form. And this document does so under very difficult circumstances on a very complex issue. By doing so, it contains differences of interest and assessments, and hence fulfills ASEAN's fundamental purpose of maintaining an at least minimal level of regional cohesion. The essential purpose of a bottle is, after all, to contain things. Second, of all the different versions of the Indo-Pacific that I've briefly described, the ASEAN document probably has most in common with the Japanese and Australian versions of the Indo-Pacific. The former because of Japan's emphasis on economics and connectivity, and the latter because, like Prime Minister Morrison's speech, it is essentially a diplomatic expedient to finesse strategic complexities and buy time. Under current circumstances, Japan and Australia are probably the two countries with which ASEAN can work most constructively. The US and China, no matter what they may claim, are at present in no mood to really listen to ASEAN. Their goal is to capture ASEAN, not work with it. Realistically, navigating the complexities of US-China competition is, at least for the immediate future, going to be more effective on the basis of national interests rather than through ASEAN, although, of course, the regional interests should always be some part of our national interests. Third, given that I see no immediate prospect of the different versions of the Indo-Pacific being reconciled with each other, let alone with the BRI, and because no idea of the Indo-Pacific or the BRI can really work without ASEAN, the minimal level or regional cohesion that the new bottle has created and the time that the new bottle has bought represents an opportunity for ASEAN to regain centrality, but no more than an opportunity. The document in and of itself does not represent ASEAN centrality. It would be a serious mistake to complacently think that having drafted a document, all we now have to do is wave it about for the major powers to queue up to beg our favor. That is not going to happen. They will be polite about the document and not reject it outright, and that represents sufficient opportunity, or at least what is practical under current circumstances. Using that opportunity is the real question. Using that opportunity is not just a matter of doing what the document says we want to do. We must, of course, try to implement our plans. No question about it. We must try to do what we say we are going to do. But the single most important lesson I have learned in the far too long time I have spent thinking and working on international relations in general, and ASEAN in particular, is that no plan is ever going to work as planned. The world is never going to arrange itself to conveniently fit our designs. We have to take advantage of what will certainly be many unanticipated developments while not losing sight of the main direction we want to go. ASEAN once had this ability, but I think it is now somewhat degraded. A certain lack of ambition and indeed perhaps even timidity has crept into ASEAN decision-making. I don't have time to go into detail on the reasons, and I think most of you are in fact familiar with the reasons. And these reasons are realities we cannot just wish away. We have to work with them. So let me just say that all the reasons are not new. We have always faced them before in even worse forms and overcome them. The challenges ASEAN now confronts are not exceptional or exceptionally severe. Tommy, you know we have gone through worse things. Let me conclude with a few words on the cast of mind that I think we should cultivate, because I think the cast of mind is the key factor. The cast of mind I think we should cultivate, and on the historical context which we seem to have forgotten. My own experience of diplomacy in Southeast Asia and my study of the diplomatic history of Southeast Asia have led me to three interrelated conclusions. First, no major power has ever been able to capture the region in entirety. Second, although the poles are not of equal weight, Southeast Asia and the broader Indo-Pacific in which it is embedded is a naturally multipolar region. Third, differences of interest both within ASEAN and between ASEAN and other powers in this extremely diverse and naturally multipolar region are the norm, which is among the reasons that make it well-nigh impossible to capture this region in entirety. The Japanese occupation during the Second World War was a brief historical exception, just as the immediate post-war period of unchallenged American preeminence was historically brief and exceptional. We are now returning to a more historically normal state of affairs, so don't panic. As the strategic crossroads between two important oceans, Southeast Asia has been, is, and will always be a contested region. As a contiguous state, China will naturally have significant influence, but it will never be the sole or even preeminent influence. The US is not going to disappear. Japan, India, Australia, and other countries will also always be present. And within the region itself, within Southeast Asia itself, Indonesia and Vietnam are not inconsequential countries. The various ideas of the Indo-Pacific, the difficulty of reconciling them, and the element of concern about China implicit in all of them is as good a way as any other way of reminding ourselves of the intrinsic complexity of our region. Complexity is challenging. Complexity is indeed very challenging, but it also creates opportunity and agency. Precisely because Southeast Asia and the broader Indo-Pacific is a naturally multipolar and contested region, there is always some maneuver space for small countries. There is always some maneuver space, provided we have the wit to recognize it and the courage to use it. To do so, we need to cultivate the habit of thinking in more than merely binary terms. And this is harder than you may think. Binary thinking is a mode of thought based on the often unconscious assumption that if something is not A, it necessarily must be B, and only B and nothing else. Binary thinking has a deceptively seductive simplicity, and there will be times when such a way of thought may well be appropriate. But it should not be our unconscious default mode of thought, as I fear it is becoming in too many ASEAN member states, including perhaps in some degree Singapore. Binary thought is an oversimplified and hence inaccurate way of comprehending our complex reality. More often than not, binary thought conscribes our strategic horizons. And more often than not, by artificially narrowing choices, binary thought instills a sense of fatalism and hence of timidity. Fatalism is fatal to small states. And on that note, I shall end. Thank you for listening to me.